Okay, good morning. Welcome, Minister Hussen, for joining us today to Threads 2023. Threads Cultural Conversations is an annual conference hosted by Saskatoon Open Door Society. And this is our third year hosting the conference. The conference brings people from all across the globe to have dialogue about cross-cultural education, about diversity, inclusion, and equity. And it's based on the shared experiences we have as humans. So we're joined by Minister Ahmed Hussen, Minister of Housing, Diversity and Inclusion of the federal government of Canada. Thank you, Minister Hussen, for making the time to join us today. Our hope today is to have a dialogue or conversation. We're hoping our theme this year is about perceiving or perceptions. And we wanted to ask you some questions about your personal professional experience. It's all about that experience. And I'll also try to chime in. So if you can maybe tell us a little bit about your early memories of your home country, Somalia, where you were born and spent your early years, Minister Hussen.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me on this talk, and I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. Very good question. I had a very happy childhood in growing up in Mogadishu, Somalia, and remember very fondly the school close to my house and living close to the national exhibition and playing with friends, playing soccer and going to the beach. So those were very fond memories, and I had a very happy childhood, and I just remember a lot of positive things, having a very loving and supportive environment until, of course, everything kind of collapsed and the country really became hard to live in terms of security, and we had to leave. But before that, my childhood was a happy one, and I had very fond memories of those early years.
Yeah, thank you so much. You and I share some of that, and I was also born in Somalia, and I grew up there in my early years. And I was young when the Civil War happened, so I have a little bit of memory. But then growing up and seeing everything just break out and all the devastation, so I'm glad that. We still have those early memories before the Civil War and how things were. So thank you for sharing that. Also, tell us a little bit about your journey to Canada as a refugee. And I know, like, refugees, people when they become refugees and how resettlement happens, people are not, except those who are seeking asylum in countries like Canada, who come most of the times or some of the times directly. A lot of other refugees spend time in other countries. So if you could tell us a little bit about your journey and how you ended up in Canada.
Well, we fled to Kenya, spent some time there, and then luckily I had a family connection to Canada. My two brothers were already here, so I joined them. And if it was not for that, I would have probably ended up either somewhere else. I'm not really sure, but my parents felt that because I already had two brothers here, it would help me to settle better in Canada, and they facilitated that connection, and I was able to come to Canada in February 1993, and it was true because of the fact that I already had some family here. It made that whole settlement process a little bit easier, because, as you know, it's really hard to settle in a new country with really leaving all your friends and networks behind and starting fresh. And the fact that I had two brothers here really made a difference and helped somewhat in that difficult settlement process.
Yeah, thank you. I also share, so you went through Kenya. I left home when I was 18 in 2001. And I ended up in Egypt, and as you know, Egypt is not next to Somalia. And after the Civil War and all the things that happened in Somalia, there's no even like direct flights, and there's a lot of restrictions, and the usage of the Somali passport is not as accepted as as it was prior to the civil war. So I ended up in Egypt, and also completely different culture, different language, and have to kind of like adapt. And I spent there about 10 years before I came to Canada. But similar to you, I also had some connections to Canada. I had cousins who were living in Canada who helped sponsored me to come to Canada, and also facilitated my resettlement and settlement process. What were your perceptions of Canada before you came, and what were your expectations of life in Canada? If you can share a little bit about that.
Well, I didn't know much about Canada before I came. I think I remember reading one article on a Canadian Olympic champion in gymnastics, and that was my only connection to Canada in terms of just really learning a little bit about it, and also hearing some radio broadcasts about hockey and things like that, which I really, I mean, the only hockey that I saw in Africa was field hockey, not ice hockey. So I didn't really know much about Canada. I knew that it was a very large country full of good people, but I didn't really have any more detailed understanding of Canada and its culture and its makeup. So completely new to me when I landed in Toronto in February 1993 in the middle of winter. It was a particularly harsh winter. Very, like, everything was new. I'd never really experienced that level of winter, or I'd never seen snow before in my life. A lot of newcomers will say the same thing, but yeah, it was a very new experience, and hardly knew anybody apart from my two brothers, and had to literally start from scratch in terms of getting to know this new land. And on one hand, that was a little scary, but on the other hand, I was also hopeful, because I felt that I had an opportunity to start a new life in this country. And slowly but surely, I started to, of course, really adapt and get used to how things are done here. And then the breakthrough for me was getting that first job, which I know for a lot of newcomers is really key for them to feel a sense of dignity, and they feel like, now I have an opportunity to earn some money to support myself and start to also get some new skills through employment, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I kind of like, it strikes me the similarities both between my journey and your journey, and also the differences. So I wasn't able to come to Canada or another country through resettlement quickly. So I spent 10 years of my life in Egypt. And that was also a very good experience and time, although early on it was very challenging because I couldn't work, I couldn't study, and I felt I was stuck at times. And then there are also other events that happened around the world, like 9/11, that also impacted the resettlement of young people especially young men from Muslim countries. So but I was happy in Egypt, and I didn't want to leave, except that I didn't have the opportunity to move freely or to become a citizen, to become fully participating member of that society. And I got the opportunity to come to Canada, and I was grown, and I had a degree, and I came, and I was able to go and enroll in a master's program in Ontario, and then was able to get a job, my first job, after 2 years in Canada, and that was in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. So I wanted to ask you about how your perceptions changed from when you first arrived until now, and what were the factors that kind of like contributed. You said initially you didn't know much about Canada, or you had a little bit about kind of like what you knew about Canada, but then how that compared to after you came here and you experienced all those early settlement stages and up to now, what changed for you?
Well, I think, I mean, like I said, I didn't really have a lot of solid opinions about Canada, because I didn't know much about Canada before I came. So there wasn't really a lot of settled views that I had that needed to be changed or confirmed, right? But I think over the years, what I obviously found out was that this is a very diverse country. It's a very large country. It's a very complex country. It's a very advanced economy, uh, very close relationship with the United States, a huge country that really punches above its weight around the world, contributes to peacekeeping. I learned about the relationship between Canada and many European countries and many countries around the world in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and Central and South America. I learned a lot about the place that Canada views itself as both an Atlantic nation, but also a Pacific nation, and then later as an Arctic nation. And just learning a lot about Canadian history, that was quite an eye-opener. In high school and also in university, I learned a lot about the Canadian contribution to the First World War, the Second World War, the Korean War, and essentially Canada's military background, Canada's peacekeeping history, and Canada's really ability to pull people together. Growing up in Canada, watching people like the Honorable Lloyd Axworthy bring, hundreds of countries to Ottawa to sign the landmine treaty, to ban landmines, the use of landmines and things like that. I mean, that was my formative years, and I really got to admire what Canada and what Canadians stand for in practical terms. And I'm always fascinated, even today, the generosity of Canadians to welcome so many newcomers, give sanctuary to refugees like myself and you, and do it in a way that really doesn't brag too much, that we're modest people, and we practice our values by actions. I also learned, of course, about the challenges, about the really dark chapters of our history with Indigenous peoples, with internment of Japanese and other Canadians, the dark chapters of our history that continue to manifest themselves in our justice system, in our prisons, in our education system, and so on. So Canada, of course, is not a perfect country. It's an ongoing project, and our job is to make it better and to continue to really have Canada live up to its full potential and its stated values through the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and our laws, our values, equality and equality of opportunity, and so on.
Yeah, thank you so much. I do appreciate kind of like talking about how good country we have within Canada, but also all those challenges. If we don't talk about the history and those past wrongdoings that we have within our system, then we can't take steps to correct them and not ensure also not to repeat them. And that is what history is about, right? So I do appreciate that. I wanted to ask you also about, as we talk about perceptions, what were the misconceptions, or how are you perceived by others? I mean, now you've got a history. You came here through your journey as a refugee, and you went through your education, your early experiences, and you are where you are now. You're a contributing member of this society. You're in your political kind of like activities and position, as well as also prior to coming to politics, you also did a lot of community development work and building community. So how have you been perceived, or how are you perceived by others?
Well, it depends who you ask, right? For some people, I'm a role model and an example of what is possible in this country. For others, they view me as someone who is doing his best to improve the country that adopted him. And for others, they still, I mean, particularly for people outside of Canada, they just can't fathom, or they can't comprehend how someone who came to this country can be elected into office and become a minister. So I think my example and the example of others before me challenges the the exclusion that some refugees and immigrants face in other countries around the world. So I think we're setting a good example. And I always say to people, my story is only possible in Canada, nowhere else. So in terms of perception, I think, some people see me as a role model, others see me as someone who is a proof point of what is possible in Canada.
Yeah, and I think that is very important, because it shows that what is possible for young people and anyone who's living in this country to be able to strive to become whatever they wanted to become. And I'm very grateful to have that opportunity to see young people growing up in this country, to see people like you and others, the diverse people that we have within our political system. Thank you so much. I think that those are good. And I think it's also a good segue of another question that I wanted to ask you. And I haven't heard this being asked of you. Maybe you may have been asked many times, but I haven't. But
no, that's fine.
What actually made you interested to be in politics? And I know you had early.
Oh, I've been asked that question many times.
Yeah, maybe I didn't follow, but I wanted maybe
that's fine.
our audience to learn a little bit about that.
So there's two ways that people end up in politics. There's people who always plan to have a career in politics, and they plan early enough, and they know early enough that that's where they want to end, which is fine. And then there's people like me who kind of end up there, but they weren't really planning on being there. So for me, I never wanted to be a politician. I never planned on that. I worked in politics. I engaged with politicians to make a difference for Canadians in my capacity as a lawyer, and before that as a community activist. But I never really was interested to become the front-facing politician. But what happens is a lot of the work that I was already doing was a small level politics. Like the work I was doing for 7 years in Regent Park was political organizing, right? So I was doing some of the work that is similar to the work that the city councillor was doing, some of the work that is similar to the work of the local provincial member of parliament and the federal member of parliament. So for many years, I was already sort of engaged in political activism and political organizing, right? To get wins for the community. And then I took time off after 7 years in Regent Park, and I went back to school, became a lawyer, came back to Toronto, and I was happy practicing law and really fighting for individual voices, right? Individual people. And then what happened to me was in that time, I noticed something interesting. So a lot of the community services that I relied on, and you relied on to get to where we are, were being cut. There were a lot of cuts, and there were a lot of attacks, even philosophically, against those services. So let me give you an example. My first job, when I was applying for it, I didn't have a printer. So I went to the local library just outside Regent Park, because Regent Park didn't have a library, to print my first resume. Now, many years later, as a lawyer, I hear people attacking libraries and saying the local mayor was attacking library and saying that libraries are for the elite, that we don't need libraries. And I said, hold on, wait a second, that doesn't sound right. Libraries are absolutely critical for low-income neighborhoods to get access to digital services. Give me a break. So I noticed those kinds of attacks on social housing, which I benefited from, on libraries, on student loans, on transit, and so on and so forth. And I started complaining about that a lot to my friends and my circles. And they started getting tired of it and said, look, why don't you do something about that? If you're complaining all the time, why don't you do something about it? And I said, well, I'm one person. What can I really do? They said, no, you're not one person. You have a history of community activism. You have a history of being able to organize people. You have a large network now because of all the things you've done. And now as a lawyer, there's a lot of people who know you. And I used to tutor kids as well, right? So they said, look, you know all these people, run for office and fight for those things, fight for those values, fight for those community services that helped you. Otherwise, please stop complaining. And I was very skeptical about the path to that political office to fight for those issues until they came and showed me that there was a path, that I could actually win in this seat where I represent the residents of York Southwestern North. So they came back to me with evidence that showed that this is a community that would elect me. Because I had a law office there, I had tutored kids there, I knew a lot of the parents, I had a very strong community roots. So they were able to showcase that if I ran there, I would win. And for me, that was the first time I actually started thinking about it, and I took it seriously, and I finally took the decision to run in 2014 for the nomination. Won the nomination in December, and the election was in October 2015. And I worked extremely hard to convince people to vote for me, and here we are. So I didn't plan on this, but in hindsight, it's interesting. My campaign platform was fighting for community services. That was it. I was saying, elect me so I can defend these services that help me, and so that we can preserve these services and expand them for the next generation. That was my campaign pitch. And I just worked hard to push that message. And luckily, we ended up in government. So in government, you could do a lot of things. And I was able to really get more community services for York Southwestern as an MP. And then afterwards, as a minister, we were able to do more community services across the country. I mean, I had the opportunity as a minister to introduce a national childcare program. That's going to make a huge difference in the lives of millions of children and millions of parents, particularly women with children. I mean, that's a huge piece. And I can say that I'm the guy who did that and signed 8 agreements before the last election. And today, after the next minister kept the work kept going, and now we have a national childcare program in all the provinces and territories in Canada. And I was the minister who happened to introduce that program as a concept, fight for it, got the money in the budget, pass it through cabinet, got the money in the budget, then start negotiating with the provinces. And I had 8 agreements before the last election. Now I'm in charge of housing. I grew up in social housing. Now I get to build housing and contribute to more housing options for Canadians. When I was in immigration, I was able to help refugees, the same people who were going through the difficulties that I was going through. So I've been very lucky, even in my portfolios, to get opportunities to make a difference for people and fight for the things that I said I would fight for, and make a tangible difference, both in my local riding, but across Canada. And I think I'm very lucky in that sense, and I'm very grateful to this country and to Canadians.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is a platform for sharing those experiences, and I think your journey to Canada and to politics is informed by your experiences as someone who moved to Canada in a young age, and I think that is something that is very inspiring.
I wanted to add something which, like, to me honestly, that is what, apart from my parents, I think what I'm about to say was the most influential experience that I had, apart from my parents, of course, right, is my life and years in Regent Park. I forgot to emphasize that. So Regent Park at that time was Canada's oldest and largest social housing neighborhood. 21,000 people lived there. So it was a city within Toronto, right? 65 different nationalities lived there. That diversity and that coming together and creating a better community is what really taught me how to be a leader. I learned from those people, particularly 2 strong women who led all of us. They were the most experienced, Deborah Deneen and Diane McLean, incredible women who really inspired me and pushed me and mentored me. Those 7 years showed me what positive politics was about. Prior to that, I thought politics was a negative thing, bad thing, don't get involved. They showed me that organizing a voice from the ground up, pushing hard for changes in community safety, in economic development, in the environment around us, in youth, seniors, services, community services. Everything that I do now as a politician in terms of listening to Canadians, introducing inclusive policies, fighting for the charitable sector, more inclusive housing, fighting for Black Canadians, fighting for Indigenous housing, all of the things that I do, I really learned from Regent Park. And that was a formative experience. Those 7 years, I really learned how to be a good leader. A good leader is someone who listens to Canadians. You can never go wrong when you listen to people. And the best way to make government policy is to listen to those whose lives will be impacted by that policy.
Thank you so much for making the time, Minister Hussen.
My
We
pleasure.
thank you for your time, and this is going to be a very interesting discussion and informative dialogue that will help make our annual Threads cultural conversations more in depth.